The most isolated water on Earth took its own sample. Nobody intended that. On the 5th of February 2012, at 3,769.3 meters down, a Russian drill broke through the last ice above Lake Vostok. The lake came up the hole after it. Water climbed 363 meters toward the surface and froze there, and that column of refrozen lake water is the only sample anyone has ever had from it. There was no time to lower a camera. Nothing went down that hole at all. 22 years of drilling through 4 kilometers of ice, and what they ended up with was an accident that set solid before anyone could reach it. A year later, they cut it out and sequenced what was inside. They found a bacterium that matched nothing in any database on Earth. Under 86% similar to any known organism. No recognized phylum would take it. The Russians announced it on the 6th of March 2013. 3 days later, a scientist on their own side of the project took the finding apart. He didn't need new data to do it. He only had to point at something that had been sitting in that borehole the entire time, tens of tons of it. That argument has never been settled. Under all that ice is a lake with a shoreline and an island in it. Its surface about 500 meters below sea level, and nothing living in that water has seen sunlight since long before our species existed. It is one of the best analogs we have for the oceans thought to be sealed under the ice of Europa and Enceladus, which is why this stopped being a story about one Russian expedition. Every serious plan for sampling a world like that runs into the exact wall the Russians hit here. Reaching a sealed world means opening it. Opening it means carrying something of your own inside. The part that should have been impossible came first. Until the 1990s, nobody could prove the lake was even there. In 1961, a navigator with the Soviet Polar Air Service named Robert Robinson noticed something about the ice he was flying over. A stretch of surface looked wrong. It was too flat, not polished smooth the way wind works ice sitting on rock, but flat the way water is flat. Nobody followed it up at the time. The Russian geographer Andrei Kapitsa, working from seismic soundings taken during Soviet expeditions in 1959 and 1964, arrived at the explanation from a different direction: liquid water underneath. The idea then sat around mostly unproven for decades. A joint British, American, and Danish radar survey in 1974 and 1975 picked up long, flat reflectors under the ice, which is what a sheet of water looks like to radio waves, though nobody at the time called it a lake. In 1993, satellite altimetry from ERS-1 traced the outline from orbit. By 1996, Russian and British data combined into the full shape. They found a lake the size of a small sea because a piece of Antarctica was too smooth. Roughly 250 kilometers long and 50 wide. Around 12,500 square kilometers of surface, which puts it in the same range as Lake Ontario. But it holds far more water than Lake Ontario does, close to 5,400 cubic kilometers, because it's much deeper. Average depth around 432 meters, more than 500 at its deepest, and possibly deeper still in places nobody has measured properly. By area, it's the 16th largest lake on the planet. Rank it by volume instead, and it lands in the top 10. The ice on top of it is nowhere thinner than about 3¾ kilometers, and in places it reaches 4¼ which raises the obvious question of why it isn't a block of ice. Two things keep it liquid. The sheer weight of the ice above lowers the freezing point of the water underneath, and geothermal heat leaking up from the interior of the Earth keeps the base of the ice sheet right at melting temperature. The result is water sitting at about -3 degrees Celsius under something close to 400 atmospheres of pressure, and it has not frozen in millions of years. The water isn't still either. Nobody has watched it move, but the physics can be modeled, and the models point the same way. Ice melts into the lake at one end, lake water freezes back onto the glacier at the other, and that imbalance alone is enough to drive a slow circulation through the whole basin. The people who went after it were working from one of the least survivable inhabited places on Earth. Vostok Station was established on the 16th of December 1957, up on the East Antarctic Plateau at 3,488 meters, about 1,300 kilometers from the South Pole, and around 1,400 from the nearest station that could help them. On the 21st of July 1983, the thermometer there read -89.2 degrees Celsius, still the lowest reliably measured natural temperature ever recorded on this planet. Winter averages hover near -66. A few dozen people in summer, about half that number through the winter, resupplied by sledge and tractor convoys that crawl well over 1,000 kilometers in from the coast. At that altitude, in that cold, the crew deal with thin air on top of everything else. Drilling at Vostok began in 1990, and it had nothing to do with biology. The ice above the lake holds a continuous climate record stretching back more than 400,000 years, one of the most cited archives in all of paleoclimate science. That was the prize. The lake was a rumor underneath it. To stop a borehole nearly 4 kilometers deep from squeezing itself shut under the pressure of the ice, you have to fill it with something. They filled it with kerosene and Freon, a column of industrial fluid over 3 kilometers tall, standing directly above the most pristine water on Earth. At the time, that was just plumbing. Nobody thought about it much. Two other things about this place, and both matter later. More than 35 million years ago, before the ice, this continent was forested. A temperate climate, real trees, a coastline. What is now Vostok may have been open sky and possibly a marine bay. And the lake itself sits inside a graben, a tectonic rift valley that started pulling open before the ice ever arrived. By the late 1990s, the drill was close enough to break into the lake in a single season, which is exactly when the world told them to stop. In January 1998, at 3,623 meters, drilling halted. Nothing had broken. The Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research recommended the halt on contamination grounds, and the Russians complied. They stopped roughly 130 meters short of the water, about the length of a football pitch. Then they left the drill parked there for years. It's easy to read that as bureaucracy strangling science. It wasn't. Punch through with that setup and tens of tons of kerosene and Freon could pour into an ecosystem that had been sealed off since before there were humans to ruin it. The only way to answer the question was to risk destroying the answer. Almost every version of this story gets one detail wrong. People describe Vostok as 15-million-year-old water. The lake has been sealed for something on that order, though estimates vary a lot across the literature. The water has not. Meltwater from the base of the ice sheet feeds in continuously. Lake water freezes back onto the underside of the glacier and gets carried off. The estimated residence time is about 13,300 years, which means the entire water mass cycles out and gets replaced. That changes the biology completely. Anything alive down there isn't a specimen sitting in a sealed jar since the Miocene. It's inside a slow, open system with an inflow and an outflow, which means it has to sustain itself rather than just persist. On what, though? That's the question everyone assumed had an obvious answer, and it turns out to be the most interesting thing about the lake. The problem at Vostok isn't scarcity. As the base of the glacier melts down into the lake, it releases the air that was trapped in the ice, bubbles that have been compressed for hundreds of thousands of years. At those pressures and -3 degrees, that gas doesn't simply dissolve and disperse. It forms clathrates, gas locked inside cages of ice, something like packed snow, stable only at those pressures and unstable the second you bring it up. Nobody has measured the oxygen in that water directly. What they have is the arithmetic. Melting ice keeps delivering gas into the lake, and the ice that freezes back out of it leaves that gas behind, so the gas has nowhere to go and keeps concentrating. Run the numbers on that, as Chris McKay and colleagues did in Geophysical Research Letters in 2003, and the dissolved oxygen in Lake Vostok comes out at roughly 50 times the concentration of ordinary air-equilibrated water. NASA's own write-up of the result described the lake water as something that would fizz like a soda if you brought it to the surface. 50 times is not a gift. At that concentration, oxygen is a hazard. The peer-reviewed language is that it may be a severe biological stress. Oxygen chemistry throws off radicals that damage cell membranes and shred DNA. And the reasonable expectation is that anything living in Vostok would need serious biochemical defenses, high concentrations of protective enzymes, simply to tolerate the water it lives in. The same researchers pointed out where else you might find that. Europa's ice shell and thin atmosphere are thought to contain oxygen and radicals produced by radiation. So Vostok may be an analog for something more specific than a sealed ocean that is chemically hostile to whatever is trying to live in it. Which is what makes the 2012 breakthrough so frustrating. The plan depended on pressure behaving exactly as predicted. Puncture the last layer of ice, and lake water should rush upward rather than drilling fluid draining down, because kerosene and freon are less dense than water. The theory said the fluid would get pushed up and away, and the rise would be somewhere around 30 to 40 meters. It went to 363. The drilling team's own technical analysis attributes that overshoot to a hydraulic fracture in the side of the borehole, which diverted a large volume of drilling fluid. In plain terms, at the moment of contact, the hole cracked and leaked. Expedition leader Valery Lukin compared what they'd done to putting a man on the moon, and on difficulty alone he had a case. But they had reached the lake without sampling it in any controlled sense. What they had was a frozen accident, and everything after that had to be reasoned backwards out of it. Through the 2012 to 2013 season, drillers went back down and recored the refrozen lake water, recovering about 32 meters of core before the geometry of the old borehole pushed the bit off sideways into ordinary glacial ice. The material went to Sergei Bulat at the St. Petersburg Nuclear Physics Institute. What came back was a bacterial phylotype designated W123-10. Every attempt to file it inside a recognized bacterial division failed, and it clustered with a previously unidentified bacterium that had turned up earlier in Vostok ice. The same unknown, twice, in different material. Bulat's phrasing to Russian media was that it was unidentified and unclassified. Phylum is the widest drawer biology has, the level at which animals with backbones sit apart from mollusks and worms. A sequence that refuses to go into any of them implies either a branch that evolved alone in the dark for millions of years, or a mistake somewhere in the pipeline. On the 9th of March 2013, 3 days after the announcement, Vladimir Korolyov, who headed the genetics laboratory where the analysis was done, told Interfax that the team had found contaminants and nothing else. His objection to the one interesting strain was a sentence long. They hadn't found it in the drilling fluid, but the bacterium could in principle use kerosene as an energy source. Kerosene was the drilling fluid, 3 kilometers of it, standing above the lake for over 20 years, in a hole that had just fractured. The strongest candidate for undiscovered life in the most isolated water on Earth was equally well explained as something that had been living in their own drill fluid the whole time. Both sides of this deserve a fair hearing, because the argument is still live. For contamination, Bulat himself has been openly cautious, warning that a single candidate organism could easily be contamination. Analyses reported in October 2012 found almost nothing native in the first drill bit sample, and the microbes they did detect traced back to drilling oil and lubricants. And in 2016, writing in Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society A, Bulat stated plainly that the technology used, an electromechanical drill with a kerosene fluid and Freon 141b as densifier, was inappropriate for collecting liquid water or clean samples. That's the lead scientist publishing that his own method wasn't good enough. Against it, the great majority of bacterial species on Earth have never been grown in a laboratory and have no genome on file anywhere, so a sequence with no match is not extraordinary on its own. And in the same 2016 paper, Bulat reports that no archaea were detected in any tested sample of that frozen lake water. Contamination should not be that tidy though. Human skin, laboratory reagents, and drilling oil all carry bacteria and almost no archaea, so an all-bacterial signal is exactly what contamination looks like. The negative result cuts both ways. They drilled deeper into ice than anyone in history, twice, and the honest scientific position afterwards was that nobody could be certain. Not because an instrument failed, but because of what was in the hole with them. The drilled water was never the only evidence, though. The other source had been sitting in a freezer in the United States the whole time. Lake water freezes onto the underside of the glacier, forming what's called accretion ice. Lake water, frozen naturally, with no drill fluid anywhere near it. At Vostok, the column is ordinary layered glacial ice, down to about 3,310 meters, then a couple of hundred meters of basal ice, and accretion ice from roughly 3,538 meters down. It came up years earlier as part of the climate coring, and whatever is in the lake is written into it. In 2013, Yuri Starkman and colleagues in Scott Rogers' lab at Bowling Green State University published an analysis in PLOS 1 of 4 sections of that core. They pulled out 3,507 unique gene sequences, about 94% bacteria, around 6% eukaryotes, and precisely 2 archaea. Just over 1,600 could be classified. Fungi, mostly. Also matches to arthropods, springtails, water fleas, a mollusk. The study also found 35 sequences matching known heat-loving or heat-tolerant species at 99% identity or better. Only 3 of those came from the section that formed over the main basin of the lake. Nearly all of them came from the ice that formed over the southwestern embayment, a shallow bay at one corner. Follow that back and it gives you a location. Accretion ice is a moving record. The glacier crosses the lake at about 3 meters a year, freezing lake water onto its underside as it goes. So a given depth in the core corresponds to a given stretch of lake surface. Thermophiles clustered in one part of the core therefore point to heat in one part of the lake, and the researchers' inference is that if there is hydrothermal activity in Lake Vostok, it's concentrated in that corner. The lake sits in a rift valley, and rift valleys are where geothermal heat tends to live. The chemistry lines up with the same story. 2 of the sequences from that section were closest to arsenic-oxidizing bacteria, and one of the main natural sources of arsenic is volcanic emission. The sequences also include matches to organisms of the sort normally found in the digestive tracts of fish. The researchers are careful about this, and it isn't proof of anything. Gut bacteria show up in soils and sediments too, and a DNA match is not a body. But those species make their living inside animals, so their presence at least raises the possibility of something bigger than a microbe down there, which is why the authors put it on the table rather than leaving it out. The sequences include both marine and freshwater species. Marine signatures, in a freshwater lake, 1,300 kilometers from any coast, under 4 kilometers of ice. There's no way to get a marine organism into that basin under present conditions, so if the signal is real, it has to be old, which fits what the geology already says about this place: a forested continent, a coastline, and a basin that may have been a bay before the ice came down and shut the lid on it. A follow-up study from the same lab in 2020 compared the microbial signal in the basal ice against the signal in the accretion ice and found few organisms in common between them. That matters because the simplest skeptical reading of all this is that meltwater from the ice base is just seeding the lake with its own passengers. If that were happening at scale, the 2 sets of ice should look alike. They don't. Accretion ice isn't a clean sample either, though. Other analyses of Vostok material have come back nearly empty, and a team that searches for sequences it can recognize will, reliably, find recognizable things. So while the argument over Vostok stalled out, other people went after the same question the slow way. In January 2013, less than a year after the Russian breakthrough, the American Wizard project reached subglacial Lake Whillans in West Antarctica using a clean hot water drill. Whillans sits under about 800 meters of ice rather than 4 kilometers, which makes it a far easier target, and that difference matters. Over 3 days, they lowered a camera, a conductivity and temperature probe, water samplers, a filtration unit, sediment corers, and a geothermal probe through the hole. They found a functioning ecosystem built on chemolithoautotrophs, microbes that pull chemical energy straight out of rock. No sunlight anywhere in the food web. Nobody argued about it, because of how they got there. 5 years later, the SALSA project drilled into Mercer subglacial lake, under 1,085 meters of West Antarctic ice. Every stage of the process was sterilized. The water came up clean, and so did the sediment. In August 2025, an international team including the Korea Polar Research Institute published the analysis in Nature Communications. From those samples, they recovered 1,374 single-cell amplified genomes. Most of them correspond to new species and new taxonomic groups, with phylogenomic and functional evidence that they are genetically isolated from marine and surface life. Among them, Patesibacteria, a group of stripped-down organisms that sit close to the edge of what a genome can afford to throw away. The whole genomes also killed off a long-standing counter-argument. There had been a suspicion that these microbes were simply leftovers from seawater intruding under the ice sheet around 6,000 years ago. Single-gene barcoding had made some of them look ordinary. Sequenced in full, they stopped looking like visitors, too divergent from anything marine to have arrived that recently, and too specialized for the conditions they're in. One of the bioinformaticians on the project called them specialists, organisms shaped by life under a glacier over a much longer stretch of time. And the metabolic picture ties straight back to Vostok. What those microbes eat, whether they run on organic matter or on rock chemistry, shifts depending on how much oxygen is available to them. Oxygen turns out to be the variable that structures the entire ecosystem, which is exactly the claim Vostok made in 2013 and couldn't defend. Unknown organisms, genetically isolated from everything on the surface. It was true. It just had to be proven somewhere the drilling was clean enough that nobody could argue. The Russians were probably right that something is down there. They made it impossible to prove. Vostok itself is still open, in every sense. W12310 has never been confirmed and has never been ruled out. Bulat's published position calls for clean entry technology and strict decontamination before anyone tries again. And Russian work at the site has continued, with St. Petersburg Mining University developing new drilling and sampling equipment for it. Meanwhile, that lid is 4 kilometers thick, and it took 22 years to get through, with a permanent station sitting on top of it, a resupply convoy, and the option to come back and try again next season. Nobody knows how thick Europa's shell is. Estimates have run anywhere from a few kilometers to 30 or more. The most direct measurement anyone has managed came from Juno's microwave radiometer, and for the one patch it looked at, the answer was about 29 kilometers. Europa Clipper launched in October 2024. It has already used Mars for a gravity assist, and this December it swings past Earth one final time before it heads out of the inner solar system for good, arriving at Jupiter in April 2030 for 49 close passes at Europa. It's built to work out whether that ocean could support life at all. Every mission after it inherits the Vostok problem in a much harder form. How do you prove a signal came from the ocean you're sampling, rather than from the machine you sent to sample it? At Vostok, when the answer was disputed, they could go back and drill again. Nobody gets a second season at Europa. We can build a machine that crosses the solar system. Building one that enters a sealed world without becoming part of the sample is the part we haven't solved. Vostok is one lake under that ice. There is also a canyon down there that drops further below sea level than any land canyon on Earth, and a mountain range the size of the Alps, first detected in 1958, that no human eye has ever seen. That's the next one.